Okay, now first, I want to talk about this. Seems real basic information, but a lot of coaches don't really think about the difference between a group and a team. And what I mean specifically is there will be teams that actually become groups. In other words, teams are really defined by people, collective individuals that share the same objectives and goals. That's pretty simple. But what happens is as teams go along and organizations go along, sometimes they reverse and become groups because they don't have the shared objectives and goals. So when you look at teams that, for example, let's just use a quantitative assessment of wins and losses. If a team, let's just use basketball, for example, goes out and wins 4 games in a row, and they're really cohesive, they're working together, and then let's say injury, one of the players gets hurt, or maybe there's 2 players that aren't really getting along or something. But anyway, then the team loses 2 or 3 in a row. It's possible that team has actually become a group. And in the research, it's really clear that when you don't have people working together with shared objectives and goals, and we're going to talk about how roles fits into that, then you've essentially become a group. So my education to you would be that understand when you become a group, because throughout a season, there are times you will become a group. That's not the end of the world. But it means that you need to figure out how to get your team, your group, back to being a team. And that's something that we really want to emphasize here, because teams that are on four game losing streaks or 8-game losing streaks, we define them as teams, but essentially most of them have become groups. Okay, so now here's how organizational climate culture is formed and developed. This is borrowed from the IO industry, the industrial organizational industry, and it really applies to sport and performance because all organizations essentially go through these stages. So if you look at the beginning, forming, the beginning phases of a group or teams, this is your tryouts, your preseason, recruiting, that type thing. The next stage is storming. This is when some members challenge authority, teammates, or the status quo and attempt to identify a role or fit into a role. Healthy. This is a very healthy stage. I want you to understand that some people think conflict within an organization or team is not healthy, but actually it's one of the most important phases of performance, because only when you storm do you find out who each other are, if you will. Who you are psychologically, who you are from an emotional standpoint, who you are in terms of your physiological competencies as well. So it's really important that teams go through this, both from a coaching staff and an athlete perspective, because coaches, there's sometimes they don't understand their roles haven't been defined for them, and so they really got to figure out where they fit. The next stage is called norming. Norms, roles, and leaders are established in the organization, and it becomes more consistent at this point. Your team, you basically name your starters, and obviously sometimes that changes throughout the season. Coaching staffs are, we're all in your positions, and then you may find out throughout your season that there needs to be changes made, sometimes within coaching staffs. We've seen it. The most kind of overt one we've seen recently is the Ravens changing offensive coordinators, I think right before they went into the playoffs a few years ago. But norming is something that happens when you've stormed and you've kind of figured out who each other are, who each other is, and where they're going. And then the last stage is performing. Members understand it, adhere to their role, and perform optimally. This is where cohesion is established and deployed. Now, in some of the slides coming up, we're going to go over specifically roles and where cohesion comes into play. Okay? Now, I want you to understand something. These don't always have to be sequential. So in other words, you can form, okay, and then you can norm without going through storming. Conversely, you can form, storm, norm, and then go back to storming again, and then hopefully come back to norming and performing. So it doesn't always happen in sequence. What we do when we consult with teams specifically, we help them understand sequence is optimal. That would be optimal, but sometimes some coaches, some head coaches aren't real comfortable with the storming phase within their staffs, and they prefer to norm first and then potentially go back to storm before performance. So, but here is the research, very clear, and at the end of my presentation, I'll provide a reference page that cites my references. The research is very clear. These 4 levels, really, to perform at your peak levels, you need to go through these, okay? And again, it doesn't always have to be in sequence, but the one thing I would emphasize to you is that storming phase. Don't be afraid as a coach to storm, because that's really where you find out where you are as an organization, both from the coaching staff and player as well, okay? All right, now, self and team efficacy. Efficacy is a psychological word really for confidence. The reason we call it efficacy is because efficacy is defined as a belief system, okay? When we work with teams, we like to build efficacy because confidence is highly variable. Confidence can change within hours, within minutes, within days. It just depends on situations. But self and team efficacy is more consistent because it's based on a belief system. And for those of you that are in education or been in education, you may recognize the name Albert Bandura, which his work is the self-efficacy piece. And he talks about, self-efficacy is the ability to overcome obstacles in the face of adversity. So we look at it in performance psychology. And by the way, I don't think I defined it at the beginning, but performance psychology is kind of a broader base world, if you will, than sports psychology. Performance means anybody that performs. So, for example, we not only help athletes and coaches perform, but first responders, surgeons, public speakers. So the same belief systems that we want our athletes to have is the same belief systems we want a surgeon to have when they're operating on us, if you will. So this self-efficacy is, a belief system. And what you do is you help your athletes reflect on times when they've had success. And again, although this is just a 45-minute presentation, we do 2.5-hour presentations just on confidence and team efficacy because it takes that long to build that in. But briefly, what I can tell you is that you want your players to be able to reflect and your coaches to reflect on past experiences where they've had success. And they can write those down, and those can be what we call process and outcome goals to help them reach a level of efficacy that's very consistent. Team efficacy becomes contagion if one or more members of a team demonstrates positive belief systems. So what this means is when you build self-efficacy within your players, then it becomes contagion, just like when you have, let's say, a player that really brings what we call like a negative cancer to a team, a negative attitude, a negative belief system. So once you get players believing in themselves and being positive, then that tends to spread over into the team. And you'll see what I mean as I go along in these slides. Okay, now, how do you build efficacy? Okay, well, here's one of the things that I don't think gets talked about enough, and that's how we present ourselves. For example, as coaches, dispositional optimism, those who postulate optimism tend to have positive explanatory styles of communication and behavior. Now, what does that mean? That means you coach from a real asset base. Instead of pointing out things, and my goal today is not to tell you how to coach, but the research is very clear that if our disposition is optimistic, and we catch athletes and we support them in their effort to be better by rewarding them when they've done the right thing, as opposed to not telling them all the time when not to do something. I walked into a basketball game, a club basketball game recently, and I heard a coach telling a player, don't do this, don't do that, don't pick up your dribble, don't do this. And so from a sport performance perspective, you don't want the athlete to focus on what not to do. You want them to focus on what to do. So you really want to have that dispositional optimism. Now, many of you may say, oh, well, you can't be positive all the time. You're right. You're right. In my years of coaching, there's times that Yeah, I completely lost it, to be quite honest with you, when I was coaching football. But generally speaking, we want to build our athletes, and that's what's going to build their belief system, as well as the piece where we have them do their reflection piece. Okay? And that's what's going to build that self-efficacy that helps build that team efficacy. So positive explanatory styles of communication tend to influence others to communicate and behave in positive ways, which cultivates optimism and confidence. So if you as a coach, for example, communicate with your coaches and with your players in a positive way, generally speaking. Again, I'm not saying we have to be perfect all the time or always be positive, but we really want to focus on building people. And the research is really clear that coaches build their belief system when they are communicated to in a very positive way. Now, again, we work with a lot of college football teams, and I can tell you right now, game day, there's a lot of select things that are said to each other on the sidelines. But generally speaking, we're talking about if we can learn to build athletes and coaches, it tends to cultivate a climate and culture. Now, let me explain what a climate is. You hear this all the time, that people say, we want to change the culture at our school. We want to change the culture of our team. Well, you can't change the culture until you change the climate. Okay? Climate is what it is right now, minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day. You can't change the culture until you change the climate. And some of the things we're talking about today speak directly to changing that climate before you even get into culture. Because culture is what's established over time. Climate is what's happening right at this minute. So self-efficacy and team efficacy are built from that dispositional optimism in the way we explain things to our teams and coaching staffs. Okay. Now, self-efficacy, learned optimism. Research indicates that individuals can learn or reframe optimistic tendencies from a depressive explanatory style. So here's the thing that I've learned. I grew up in a time where I played high school and college football when it was pretty normal to be coached from what we call a deficit base. People would call you names. I remember I had a college coach that called me a 240-pound wet noodle on a regular basis, and I thought, wow, how is that motivating me? And the research is clear, it doesn't. So we have to learn that if we can learn to reframe by being optimistic, we can really help athletes who come from that base or coaches that come from that base. Because I was raised in that in high school, college, and in my short time in the NFL too, and if I can change, then anybody can change. Because it really, after going through my PhD program and seeing all the research of how people perform better, it's very clear that really we can reframe their thinking and their behavior if we act real positive around them. Because I can tell you this, people, when colleges or high schools or pro teams bring in new coaches to change the climate and culture, if you will, to win, those type of things, what's really happening, and there's a new viewpoint that's coming in. There's new communication that's coming in. There's new attitudes, belief systems. And so that's really at the base of turning that efficacy, is learning how to communicate with our teams in a very positive way and building. So just remember, again, there are times that you will be negative. There's times that you will say things you really don't mean to say, and I understand that in the heat of the moment. But from a general basis, if you can model that optimism, your team will tend to model that the same way.